Welcome to the JFK assassination, Do the Math, Part 4C. In this segment, I use an alternative method to show my placement of the assassins is correct. And by doing so, I bring all the elements together to show you that every aspect, the speed of the bullets, the dictabelt sounds, the speed of sound, the angle of the wounds, and the film record are all mathematically linked. In this segment, for the speed of sound and the bullets, I use the information found in Dr. D.B. Thomas's work, Hear No Evil, published in 2001. I will begin by concentrating on shot number 3, the fatal headshot. I begin here because there is no doubt that a bullet struck in frame 313. Why 313 and not 312 as some have opined? Because the effusion leaving the wound is seen in frame 313. It took the bullet less than 3/10,000ths of a second to pass through the president's head. That is less than 1/2% of the exposure time of a frame. So when one sees the effusion, one knows that the bullet has struck in that frame. I have chosen 312.20 as when the bullet struck. This should be the end of the blacked out transition between frames, which I believe is at the beginning of each frame. The math will either prove or disprove that this assumption is correct. To find when the bullet was fired, one takes the distance from the assassin to the victim and divides that number by the speed of the bullet. The distance from the assassin is 320 feet. The speed of the bullet at this distance is 1,875 feet per second. The time it took the bullet to travel this distance is 0.1707 seconds. In order to find the frame in which the bullet was fired, one first has to find the number of frames that were exposed during the flight of the bullet. To find this, one divides the time the bullet traveled by the speed of the film, which is 0.055 seconds. And the result is 3.1030 frames were exposed from the time the bullet was fired until it struck the victim. So we subtract the number of frames exposed from the frame in which the bullet struck, and we find the bullet was fired at frame 309.10. Now there is no way to visually confirm that this is when the bullet was fired, but this information will give us the frame in which the loud sound of the rifle shot startled Mr. Zapruder and caused him to react, which will be confirmation. For the time it took the sound to reach Mr. Zapruder on shot number 3, we will use the same formula as we did in the last segment for shots 1 and 2. Keep in mind, Mr. Zapruder is 12 feet above the motorcade, and the horizontal distance is 310 feet. This distance was found by using the angle of the wound from the president's head. By using the Pythagorean theorem, one finds the distance the sound traveled to Mr. Zapruder is 317 feet. By dividing the distance the sound traveled by the speed of sound, 1,123 feet per second, we find that it took 0.2823 seconds for the sound to reach Mr. Zapruder. By dividing this number by the speed of the film, one finds the number of frames exposed until the sound reached Mr. Zapruder is 5.132. By adding this number to the frame in which the bullet was fired, one gets 314.23, which means the sound reached Mr. Zapruder at the very beginning of the exposure of frame 315. When we look at frame 315, we see that the camera was jerked upwards. One can see this best by following this piece of paper. In frame 314, the paper is up here. In frame 315, the paper is down here. In frame 316, the paper is back up here. Also, if one checks the windshield of this motorcycle, it's also blurred in frame 315. So by these items, we have confirmation of unusual camera movement that is consistent with a startle reaction. Now you will note that there's also a lot of blurring from frames 313 through 314. Why? If the sound reached Mr. Zapruder at frame 315, what caused the obvious startle reaction at frame 313 and 314? The answer is that sound is not the only thing that can startle someone. What one sees can startle one just as badly, if not more so than sound. Hollywood has made billions startling people with visual effects, and they were doing that even before movies had sound. What Mr. Zapruder saw during the exposure of frame 313 was very startling. Still not convinced? Then let's do the math on shot number 2. To find when the second bullet struck, we start with taking the adjusted time between shots 2 and 3, which is 4.7394 seconds. Then we divide this by the speed of the film to obtain the number of frames that were exposed between the two shots, which is 86.17. Next, we subtract this from 312.20, and the result is frame 226.03, which means that frame 227 was just beginning its exposure when the bullet struck. So let's check the frames to see if there's any visual verification. In frame 226, we find the frame is stable and clear with the most minor of background blurring. In frame 227, there's also minor background blurring, but the governor has turned sharply to his right and is quite blurry. His right arm is either too blurry to see or is not visible. As many have stated, his right arm is in the process of going down and then flipping back up while still holding on to his hat. These reactions are consistent with the bullet hitting the governor just under the right shoulder and the bullet passing through his chest and hitting his right wrist with enough force to cause a displaced fracture. The background is clear, which means it's the sudden moves of the occupants, not the camera, that causes this blurring. A check of frame 230 shows a perfectly clear and stable picture of both the background and the occupants. To find when this bullet was fired, again we take the distance from the rifle, which is 255 feet, and divide it by the speed of the bullet. Since the distance from the assassin to the victim is not as far as shot number 3, the speed of the bullet has to be adjusted upwards. It is 1880 feet per second. We subtract the number of frames while the bullet traveled from the rifle to the victim, Governor Conley. We find that the bullet took 0.1356 seconds to reach the governor, during which time 2.4662 frames were exposed. By subtracting the number of frames exposed during the flight of the bullet, we find the bullet was fired at frame 223.56. Now, because the position of the assassin has changed from the Elm Street side of the building to the Houston Street side, we must recalculate the distance from the rifle to Mr. Zapruder. As stated in Part 4B, the assassin is 15 feet closer to Mr. Zapruder. By using the Pythagorean theorem, the new distance is 303 feet. Again, we will divide the distance by the speed of sound. It took the sound 0.2698 seconds to reach Mr. Zapruder, and that means 4.9057 frames were exposed by the time the sound reached him. This means that Mr. Zapruder heard the sound of the second shot at frame 228.47, which is during the first half of the exposure of frame 229. Let's check to see if there's visual confirmation. A check of frame 228 shows a very clear frame without blurring. Frame 229 shows significant blurring. Most notable is the blurring of this concrete block wall, this tree, and this gentleman. It is clearly caused by the movement of the camera. A check of frame 230 shows another perfectly clear frame. This is confirmation of a startle reaction occurring in frame 229. Since there is no visually disturbing action occurring in frame 229, the startle reaction could not be visually induced. And since only frame 229 in this group of frames has such blurring in it, it is direct proof that the blurring was caused by a startle reaction to Mr. Zapruder by the sudden, loud sound of rifle shot. Now, the first shot occurred 1.08 seconds earlier. By dividing the time between the shots by the speed of the film and subtracting that from the frame in which the bullet struck for the second shot, we find that the first bullet that struck the president did so in frame 206.39. A check of frame 207 is inconclusive. The president's head is slightly blurry, which is consistent with the bullet passing through the soft tissue area of the neck. However, a check of frame 206 also shows the president's head slightly blurry, which could be caused by several reasons unrelated to being shot. The only significance of this frame is that the president's head is not perfectly still, which make it impossible that the president was hit by a bullet in this frame. By dividing the distance from the rifle to the president, which is 238 feet, by the speed of the bullet, we find that the time it took the bullet to reach him was 0.1266 seconds. Then we divide that number by the speed of the film. By subtracting that number from the frame in which the bullet struck, we find that the shot was fired at frame 204.09. Since the distance from the rifle to Mr. Zapruder was the same for shots 1 and 2, we can simply add the same number of frames we calculated it took the sound to travel to Mr. Zapruder for shot number 2 to the frame in which the bullet was fired for shot number 1. And we find that the sound reached Mr. Zapruder at frame 209.00, which is the beginning of the exposure of frame 210. A check of frame 208 shows no blurring at all. In frame 209 there is some blurring. In frame 210 the blurring is much more pronounced. In particular, compare the curb and its shadow in frame 209 to 210 and then against frame 211. The difference is dramatic. Clearly there is a startle reaction in frame 210 and not in 209 or 211. And once again, I'm running out of time. In our next segment, I will do the double check that will confirm these figures. Until then, thanks for watching.